When the war ended, thousands were trapped in places where no one wanted them anymore. Some had lived there their whole lives, others had arrived by order of the Reich, but that no longer mattered. As soon as German control fell, evictions began. They took people away without asking, some were put on trucks, and others were left lying in front of their houses. In many areas, the first bodies appeared at the edge of the tracks, in closed yards, or buried near empty farms. The stations stopped moving passengers and became filled with detainees. Schools closed for a time and then reopened with bars on the windows. Some were locked up without food, others didn't make it alive to any destination. The lists circulated without stamps or signatures. The houses changed owners in silence. Names disappeared from the records as if they had never been there. There was no trial, no order, no number written down. Only empty streets, new doors and censuses without a trace. How was it possible that so many were killed without defense, just for speaking a language or having the wrong surname? The Hungarian Revenge, the murders in Budapest and beyond. When the Germans left Hungary, they left behind thousands of people who had no way to escape. Many were civilians, others were soldiers who no longer wore uniforms. They all spoke German. That was enough. As soon as the Soviets passed through, the settling of scores began. No one waited for a tribunal, and there were no written orders. Each neighborhood decided for itself what to do with those who remained. In Budapest, armed groups without insignia went house to house looking for the Germans. They didn't ask for papers. If the surname sounded German or if someone pointed them out, it was clear. Many were taken from their homes in their underwear. Some were tied with electrical cables and loaded onto open trucks. Neighbors watched from their windows, some applauded. The streets filled with screams, broken glass and people begging. No one intervened. They were taken to yards, warehouses or empty corners. They were forced to form a line. Some tried speaking Hungarian to blend in, but the blows came anyway. Once lined up, they were shot without a word. Sometimes, before firing, they were forced to dig a hole in the ground. Those who couldn't received a blow with a rifle butt. After the shots, they all fell into the same pit. If anyone kept moving, they were finished off. The bodies were hurriedly covered with dirt and stones. Some stray dogs roamed the site for days. Outside the capital, the scenes were different, but the end was the same. In small villages, prisoners were taken on foot to the banks of the river. The younger ones had stones tied to their feet. A militiaman would give the order, and they were thrown into the water from bridges or cliffs. Local fishermen already knew not to use nets in those areas for several days. In other places, they were used as labor for weeks. In destroyed factories or abandoned warehouses, they were made to move rubble without rest. They slept on the ground, ate scraps. If anyone complained, they received a punch or were locked in a cell without light. Some died from infections. The sick were dragged outside and left lying in dirt yards where the summer heat dried them out in a few hours. A group of German women was locked in an old school. The windows were broken, the doors chained shut. Every night, men who didn't belong to any military force would enter. They came and went without explanation. Many women left bleeding, without clothes or covered with blankets. Some disappeared. Those who survived were forced to clean the hallways with hand brushes. If they didn't finish on time, they didn't eat. In Szombathely, an entire family was murdered in front of their house. The father worked as a baker, spoke fluent Hungarian, but someone said that during the war, he had fed German soldiers. Someone painted a red cross on their door. The next day, 5 men entered, dragged them to the garden, and placed them against the wall. One of the neighbors tried to intervene, but they threatened him with a knife. They shot 3 times. No one collected the bodies until night. The Germans who were captured by paramilitary groups were often used as trophies. They shaved their heads, hung signs on their chests that read, "Murderer" or "Invader." They were made to walk through the streets with their hands tied while people hit them with brooms, shoes or stones. Sometimes they were left hanging from posts with poorly made ropes. They didn't last long hanging. When they fell, they were dragged to an open field and buried without a name. Some tried to hide in churches or monasteries. The priests initially protected them, but seeing that it could cause them problems, they turned them in. They were taken out in procession, hands raised, guarded by armed militiamen. One of the priests was accused of being a traitor for having given refuge to a young German woman. They tied him to a bench and beat him until he lost consciousness. He never gave mass again. Municipal records began to disappear. The birth certificates of the Germans were burned in offices. Some officials would cross out German names in property records with black ink. Empty houses were occupied by local families without papers. When someone claimed them, they were accused of being collaborators. Several were executed for claiming their own furniture. In a cemetery in Debrecen, more than 40 bodies were found piled up, most with their hands tied with wire. They had no visible wounds. Some had plastic bags over their heads. They were buried in a pit without a gravestone. Neighbors knew who they were, but no one wanted to speak. A child found a ring with the initials GR and handed it over to the school. The next day, his family was temporarily relocated to another province. Local radios did not mention the events. The newspapers talked about reconstruction, peace, and work. No complaints were recorded. The Germans who survived did so in silence. Many never spoke their language in public again. Some pretended to be of other nationalities. They changed their surnames, learned basic Hungarian phrases, started from scratch without documents or family. The militiamen responsible remained in their posts or moved to other cities. There was never a trial. No one gathered testimonies. The pits were covered with grass. The records were sealed or destroyed. What happened in Hungary between the summer and autumn of 1945 did not remain in any official memory, only in the marked walls of the empty houses and in the names that stopped appearing on the mailboxes. The Yugoslav reprisals, camps, marches, and massacres. As soon as the Germans withdrew from the Balkans, armed partisan bands filled the vacuum. The orders were vague, but everyone understood what needed to be done. The villages where ethnic Germans, the so-called Volksdeutsche, lived were surrounded, looted, and marked with paint on the walls. In the early days, there were no lists or records, just arbitrary arrests. Those with German surnames, those who spoke oddly, those who didn't seem to belong. Many were shoved out of their homes. They were given no time to grab anything. No coat, no bread, no papers. The men were separated by age. The elderly were sent straight to pits. The young were tied in groups of 10 and sent to walk aimlessly. They were not told where they were going or for how long. Some walked for weeks. They slept on stones with swollen ankles and torn clothes. Along the way, they were watched by armed soldiers, most of them in old uniforms without insignia. They didn't speak, didn't answer questions. If someone stopped to rest, they were pushed with the rifle butt. If they fell, they were left behind. Sometimes they didn't even wait for them to die. A shot in the back, and the group would move on. The women and children were taken to filthy sheds, abandoned schools, or empty churches. The conditions were always the same: leaking roofs, straw on the floor, rusty buckets used as toilets. There were no beds, no blankets, no food beyond a watery soup or a piece of mouldy bread. In some places, the guards entertained themselves by humiliating the prisoners. They were forced to sing in the local language, to march naked, to clean the floor with old rags tied to their feet. In Vojvodina, an old factory was used as a concentration camp. There were no fences, only a few soldiers watching with machine guns from makeshift towers. The prisoners were forced to work dismantling the place. They removed beams, dragged rubble, carried sacks of lime or cement under the sun. If they complained, they were beaten. Some were hung upside down for hours. One was tied by his hands and feet and thrown into an empty storage room. He died the next day without anyone pulling him out. The deaths were not immediate. Most died slowly, from infection, from poorly treated wounds, from hunger. Many collapsed in the middle of work. Sometimes their bodies were collected and piled up near the entrance. Other times they were buried nameless in an open trench. The children who cried too much were covered with blankets or separated from their mothers. Some were taken to other camps and never returned. In some villages, the partisans organized popular trials. They were farces held in school courtyards, where one person read made-up charges and another shouted the sentence. They lasted no more than 5 minutes. The accused were executed right there in front of the neighbors. Some of the attendees clapped. Others stood still with a stone-faced expression. No one protested. In some areas, the women were used as spoils. They entered the camps at night, took them out of the sheds without a word. Some returned with torn clothes, bleeding. Others never returned. When someone asked about them, they received a shove or a punch in the mouth. In the camp records, none of these disappearances appeared. The entry books only recorded numbers, nothing else. In Bosnia, a group of Germans was forced to dig their own graves. They were given shovels without handles and told that if they worked fast, they could live. When they finished, they were forced to get inside. Some tried to resist. They didn't last long. They were shot above the hole. The earth was hastily thrown in. No one marked the site. Those who were watching were threatened with the same fate. In Novi Sad, there was a camp where most were elderly. They were kept locked in an old wooden warehouse. During the cold nights, they were only given water. A woman died hugging her grandson. A man took off his jacket to cover 2 children who were shivering. He was found dead from hypothermia. No one picked up his body until the 3rd day. The partisans filmed some punishments. With old cameras, they recorded how they beat prisoners, how they forced them to march barefoot on stones, how they cut their hair with rusty knives. They said it was educational material. Then they hid or destroyed those tapes. Some survived. Years later, they appeared in closed archives without labels, without dates. The expulsions were also punishments. In groups of hundreds, they were loaded onto trucks or forced to walk to the border with Austria or Hungary. Those who couldn't keep up were separated and executed. An elderly woman who could no longer walk was put on a cart and thrown from a bridge. Her body never appeared. In the official lists, she was listed as relocated. The villages where the Volksdeutsche had once lived were repopulated with families from other areas. The German cemeteries were vandalized. Tombstones were broken, names erased, flowers planted on top. The houses were occupied without paperwork. The furniture changed owners. Family photos were burned in public bonfires. No one asked for explanations. No one offered them. The local authorities closed the camps without notice. Some prisoners were released without papers, without a destination. Others simply disappeared. When the Red Cross requested to enter, they were shown the empty sheds. The ground still had dry stains and the walls were marked with initials. No one explained anything. They said no one had ever been there. British and American silence. They knew everything. The British and American forces arrived in Germany and Austria when the mass displacement of Germans was already underway. In many villages, the Allied soldiers passed by groups of German civilians walking with bags on their shoulders, wearing torn clothes, swollen feet, and not knowing where they were going. The commanders knew exactly what was happening. There were reports circulating, letters, telegrams, photographs. Yet most chose not to intervene. In some areas controlled by the British, German refugees were locked in temporary camps. At first glance, they appeared to be organized facilities, but it only took stepping inside to see otherwise. Broken roofs, overflowing latrines, long lines for half a cup of soup. When inspection teams arrived, the officers would tidy everything up. They hid the sick, swept the hallways and placed guards in clean uniforms. Then, when they left, everything returned to the way it had been. An American soldier described a camp in Austria where more than 2,000 Germans, mostly elderly women and children, were held. He said it smelled of death. Many slept on cardboard, some in puddles of their own urine. A baby had been born between 2 broken chairs. The mother did not survive. The body lay there for 2 days until a group of prisoners buried her with a borrowed shovel. The commander of the camp was informed. He did nothing. In several internal reports from the British Army, forced marches were described. Columns of people walking for days, flanked by men with rifles. In some cases, witnesses reported that the guards shot anyone who fell behind. Despite this, the higher-ups did not stop the expulsions. Those documents were filed away, marked as sensitive or for internal use. The Americans allowed the passage of columns of deported people through their zones as long as they didn't deviate or cause disturbances. There were occasions when the officers themselves handed over German refugees to local militias. In one southern city, a group of Germans sought protection in a church. They were escorted by American soldiers to the nearest police station. There they were left. That same night, all of them were killed. The official report registered it as a successful transfer. In the areas occupied by the British, some Germans were forced to return to their home villages, knowing they would be lynched there. Those who refused were denied access to food and shelter. Some surrendered from hunger. Others were found dead in the fields on the outskirts. No one checked their names. They were simply noted as absent. In West Germany, groups of displaced people who managed to cross from Poland and Czechoslovakia were confined to schools, barracks, and even abandoned stations. There were more people than beds, more hunger than food. Some tried to escape. They were caught by patrols and forcibly returned. They were not criminals. They just wanted to move. But for the Allied authorities, they were a logistical problem, not human beings. The British media received letters, photographs, and testimonies about what was happening. Some organizations tried to publish reports about the abuses, but the government censors stopped them. They said it was untimely information. The same happened in the United States. Complaints from Europe were received, but they were filed away without investigation. Even some diplomats recommended not feeding pro-Nazi narratives. In 1946, meetings were held between British military authorities and representatives from Eastern countries. These meetings discussed population flows, the necessary order in the new territories, and lasting solutions. Executions, rapes, and camps were never mentioned. When any delegate tried to bring it up, the topic was changed. The minutes of these meetings are brief. They only record general statements and agreements about transportation. The Allies facilitated the transfers. They provided wagons, fuel, and safe routes. They knew what happened during these journeys. Reports spoke of closed wagons, without ventilation, with dead bodies upon arrival. But the trains kept leaving. It was easier to empty the areas than to fill them with supervisors. On one occasion, a British officer requested to suspend a shipment because of the conditions of the group. They responded that there was no alternative. Some Allied soldiers individually tried to help. They shared rations, hid children, offered water, but these were isolated cases. The chain of command did not support these actions. In some cases, those soldiers were penalized for compromising neutrality. One was transferred for unprofessional conduct after intervening for a woman who was being dragged by a patrol. There were testimonies from military nurses who visited makeshift hospitals with dozens of wounded Germans. Some had exposed fractures, others were covered in bruises. The nurses wanted to report it. Their superiors told them it was not their concern. They were ordered to focus only on Allied patients. One of them wrote in her diary, "This is worse than I imagined. They won't even let me talk about it." In certain areas of Austria, the Allies shared buildings with local groups in charge of the expulsions. There were screams at night, isolated gunshots, trucks entering and leaving without plates. The soldiers knew what was happening. Some even bet on how many would fall that week. It was an open secret, but no one lifted a finger. The British and American governments knew that if all of this came to light, there would be a scandal. That's why they controlled the language in the official reports. They never spoke of executions or punishment camps. Only terms like transfers, population movements, or post-conflict relocations were used. Documents that mentioned direct abuse were removed, classified, or rewritten. It wasn't for national security. It was to hide what everyone knew and no one wanted to stop. Where the soldiers died standing. The trucks arrived with the tarpaulins lowered, moving through the trees until they reached a clearing with dry mud. There were no fences, no towers, no signs. Just a large area with a sunken barn and a few tents. The German soldiers got off in a line, unarmed, some still wearing boots without laces or bandages on their hands. One of the men in charge of unloading shouted at them to walk to a trench. Another took roll call with a stained piece of paper. There was no registry, no food, no place to sit. A group was pushed into a building without windows. At the door, 2 men with armbands checked pockets and took away belts. Hours passed without orders. Inside the building, the air was thick and smelled of dampness. Some leaned against the walls, others slept sitting. A young man with a bruised face fainted. No one helped him. Outside, the mud stuck to the guards' boots. One of them broke branches with his foot while keeping watch. When another group arrived in the evening, there was no space left. The newcomers were left outside, lying on wet blankets. In the early morning, a man began convulsing. A militiaman approached, dragged him to the edge of the field, and returned without saying a word. The next morning, buckets of murky water and black bread in a box appeared. They were thrown into the center of the group. The one who approached first was beaten. Some ate standing up, others hid pieces under their clothes. An elderly man asked for help for an injured person. A guard shoved him with the barrel of the weapon. The injured man was lifted by 2 companions and taken behind a tarp hung between trees. He didn't come back. Blood-stained bandages and a dirty cap were left on the ground. Around noon, a patrol went into the forest with 4 prisoners. None of them returned. Another group was forced to dig into the earth, not knowing for what purpose. When they finished, they were made to sit at the edge of the hole. An officer walked behind them, saying short phrases. One of the detainees looked up. He was hit with the rifle butt. The shot came after. The others didn't move. 5 minutes later, the pit was full. The earth was pushed on top with metal shovels. In the following days, more prisoners arrived. Some were wounded, others in civilian clothing. No one asked where they came from or what rank they held. They all went to the same place. Some were taken to the building, others to a separate field surrounded by rusty wire. At night, there were sounds of blows. Sometimes screams, sometimes nothing. When it rained, the roofs couldn't hold up. There were leaks over the wet mattresses. One of the soldiers covered himself with papers torn from a military manual. He used it until it tore in his hands. A boy, about 15 years old, arrived walking with his feet bandaged. No one knew who had captured him. He was seated next to the adults. He trembled. A young militiaman kicked him to make him move. The boy didn't speak. He was left in the darkest corner of the barn. The next morning, he was no longer breathing. They took him out wrapped in a torn blanket. He was buried next to a pile of unmarked graves. When the news from the front changed, the place began to empty. Some officers disappeared. Others changed their uniforms for civilian clothes. The last prisoners were put on trucks and taken in different directions. There was no list. No one knew how many had passed through there. On the ground were remnants of boots, open cans, dark stains on the walls. One day the camp was left empty. The tents fell with the wind. The barn was filled with rats. The leaves covered the trenches. No one came back. The German women, rapes, humiliations and death. Those who were left behind when the German troops fled had no one to turn to. Most were women, many with children hanging from their arms, or with clothes soiled from days without shelter. As soon as the soldiers from the other side entered, the situation changed suddenly. In the first houses where they found German women, they were pulled from the bedrooms, shoved against the walls, and the abuse began. In cities like Breslau or Königsberg, hundreds of women were raped on the same night. There was no distinction. Young, old, pregnant. Groups entered the houses, took what they wanted, and if they found resistance, they beat the women until they stopped moving. Some did not survive. Others were forced to move from one room to another while waiting for their turn. Many tried to hide in churches, but not even that saved them. In several villages, they were dragged from the altars. A nun was seen trying to protect a girl and ended up being dragged through the halls with a bloodied face. In some cases, they locked the women in barns and left them there for several days. They took turns. When they were released, many could no longer walk. The streets were full of remnants, torn underwear, blood-stained handkerchiefs, footprints on the mud. In one village, a group of women was forced to walk naked through the center, while men clapped from the sidewalks. They spat on them, threw stones at them, and some were kicked until they lost consciousness. All this while, officers watched without saying anything. There were girls raped in front of their mothers. Some were killed right after. Others were forced to stay in the houses while the soldiers took turns. If anyone tried to escape, they were shot or beaten until they lost consciousness. In one school, 30 women were locked in a classroom. They spent 2 full days hearing screams without water or food. When the door was opened, some no longer responded. In makeshift hospitals, the victims arrived in silence. Some couldn't speak. Others only repeated disconnected phrases. The doctors treated them with the little they had: rags, dirty water, alcohol. There were no medicines or psychological help. After a few days, they were told to leave, even if they couldn't walk. Some died at the entrance. They covered them with old blankets until someone came for the bodies. Those who became pregnant from the rapes had no option. In many cases, they were rejected by their own families. Some tried to end the pregnancy on their own. They hung stones around their necks or drank liquids they found in basements. In one area of Silesia, 5 women died in 1 week from trying to abort with kitchen utensils. No investigation was opened. The mothers who managed to protect their daughters hid them in basements, behind furniture, or among animals. Some spent weeks without going outside, eating stale bread or drinking rainwater. But even so, many hiding places were discovered. If they found the mother alone, they beat her until she revealed where the girls were. Sometimes they killed them in front of the children. Others were used to force them to come out. In some villages, the rapes were not just by soldiers. Local civilians also participated, men from the area who knew the victims beforehand. They took advantage of the confusion to take revenge, or simply out of hatred. Some women were tied to posts with signs hanging that said, "German whore." They were left exposed for hours. Sometimes they were sprayed with paint, other times with excrement. All of this happened in full view of everyone. The authorities knew what was happening. There were reports, verbal complaints, even some written ones. But no one did anything. Sometimes they recommended calming down, keeping order, or not exaggerating. Meanwhile, in the temporary shelters, women gathered among themselves out of fear. They slept in rows, their backs touching. They placed furniture in front of the doors. But if armed men arrived, there was nothing they could do. Many tried to flee to other areas, walking kilometers along muddy and snowy paths. Some disappeared along the way. Others were found lying in the woods with their clothes torn off. At a train station, a woman hung herself from the platform with a rope made of sheets. She had been raped 3 times the night before. No one stopped to look. In the official documents, almost none of this was recorded. Only cold numbers appeared, terms like incidents or misunderstandings. The names of the victims were never written down. Their stories were only told in whispers, in hushed voices. Some became mute, others left forever. For decades, these women carried the burden without receiving apologies, justice, or compensation. The scars were not just physical. Many never trusted anyone again. Not neighbors, not doctors, not even their own families. And those who tried to tell what happened to them were silenced. They were called exaggerated, liars, or traitors. Linz, where no law was left. When the city collapsed and the flags changed hands, several people entered the Auersperg Palace as if it were theirs. Inside, most of them wore flashy hats, as if they were at a party. The owner of the building was Princess Agathe Croy, but in those days, the place seemed like a private club for old aristocrats. Everywhere you looked, there were relatives with long titles and surnames that sounded from another time, as if that could shield them. Even some who had come from Dachau now moved between armchairs and curtains, as though they had won something. Amid the chaos, a few tried to assign positions and pretended to lead the country. A man named Raoul Bumbala even greeted the Russians as if he were president. One man who had come from the prisoner camp couldn't understand anything when he saw so many nobles among the supposed resistance. He said he expected to find different people, and he wasn't wrong. A few days later, several of those leaders were arrested for getting too close to the wrong Nazis. One managed to escape in time and crossed into the West before he was caught. On the other hand, the Soviets looked completely out of place. Some wore uniforms with epaulets so exaggerated that they looked like opera actors. Others didn't even look like soldiers. What they had was power, and they knew it. As soon as they entered the city, they took control. For the middle-class Austrians, the arrival of the Russians did not bring order but fear. The troops sought vengeance and carried it out without asking questions. On the way to Linz, the trains were filled with women, children, and some elderly men. Most spoke German. They were stopped, pulled off, and immediately beaten. Some were hanged in the square with signs around their necks. The message was clear and didn't need translation. The locals saw it and stayed silent, some out of fear, others with pleasure. In certain villages near the border, partisans emerged from the forests as if they were hunting. Instead of prey, they found German prisoners and forced them to march without water. One man who walked with them said that those who couldn't keep up were left lying behind, and no one looked back. Sometimes a short shot was the only thing heard. There were houses that became makeshift prisons, people detained just for speaking the wrong language or for having worn a uniform months earlier. The streets of Linz, already broken from the war, now had new stains. The troops, with no one controlling them, ravaged what remained: food, clothes, women. In the following days, several German soldiers were taken from hospitals where they were recovering and brought to empty courtyards. There they were placed against the wall. No one said anything to them. There were no trials. Only the sound of gunfire could be heard. In one case, they left the bodies there for days as a warning. Some neighbors covered their windows to avoid seeing it. Others just watched from a distance. In an old factory on the outskirts, they used a shed to lock up more than 50 civilians. Among them were a baker, a school teacher, and even a woman who barely left her house. They all spoke German. A local commander decided that was enough. The next morning, several of them were dead. The rest were loaded onto a truck and no one ever saw them again. At the train stations, the lists changed every hour. Names were crossed out, others added. Some thought they were going to be released. Others knew the opposite was true. One man said that when he heard his name, he tried to hide among sacks of flour. They found him anyway and dragged him outside. The last thing he saw was the smoke of a bonfire where they threw documents. The city of Linz, which had once been just a dot on the maps of the empire, became a lawless zone. The statues still stood, but those who ruled now were others. There was no talk of factions or ideologies anymore. What mattered now was which group you had belonged to yesterday. In the northern neighborhoods, a sort of makeshift tribunal was set up. One of the Russians had a gavel, and another read names aloud. There were no lawyers, no witnesses. If anyone sounded German, they were pushed into a room at the back. No one came out of there. Those who resisted were beaten until they could no longer stand. Meanwhile, on the outskirts, bodies appeared in ditches, rivers, and the gardens of abandoned houses, sometimes with a rope around the neck, other times with poorly aimed gunshots. A woman who was looking for her husband ended up finding a row of bodies lined up like sacks. She didn't know which one was him until she saw a scar on his hand. The execution of prisoners at Biscari, the captain's order. On a dry dirt airstrip south of Sicily, an American platoon had several German and Italian prisoners lined up, all captured that same day. Most wore their shirts unbuttoned, some were in t-shirts, all were unarmed. They sat in a row against a low wall, their hands on their knees. A sergeant looked back and forth without saying anything, his helmet crooked. Another soldier, younger, aimed a machine gun at the line. The commanding officer approached, shouted something in English, and without waiting for a response, raised his hand. The man with the machine gun fired. The bodies jerked. Some fell forward, others to the sides. One crawled 2 meters before lying still. Dust floated in the hot air. A few minutes later, another group of soldiers arrived from a nearby hill, bringing more prisoners. They were shoved with the rifle barrels, forced to run in a line. Among them was a man with a bandaged leg and another wearing a dirty cap. The unit commander, with his sleeves rolled up, ordered them to stop. He made a gesture with his hand and walked up, stood in front of the group, looked at one of the captives, and asked something. The prisoner, not understanding, lowered his gaze. The officer drew his pistol and shot him at point-blank range. He then turned and shot another. He did this again and again until the last one fell on top of the others. A couple of soldiers stood watching the bodies. One muttered something, the other turned away. The officer wiped his gun with a rag he pulled from his pocket. He gave a short order, and several men began dragging the bodies to a trench they used as a dump. In the line, there were remnants of bread, cans, broken boots, and pieces of cloth. They threw the bodies in. One didn't fit, so they pushed it with a foot. That night, the camp smelled of gunpowder. Several men were silent, some sharpening bayonets without speaking. The officer ate from an ammunition box. A few meters away, the man who had fired the machine gun smoked without looking up. On the ground there were dark stains and a helmet with dry blood. The next day, a senior officer arrived. He walked between the tents without saying anything until he found the commander. He asked about the prisoners. The commander gave a short reply. He led him to the execution site. There, marks were left in the dirt and a row of shell casings. The superior frowned, asked for the documents. There were no papers, only lists with no names and a broken notebook with numbers. He wrote something in a small notebook and left without giving instructions. A few days later, an internal report circulated among the ranks. Some read the folded sheet and put it in a drawer. One of those involved was reassigned to another unit. The commander was called to testify. He said the prisoners posed a risk, that one had tried to escape. No evidence was presented. The case was filed away. On that land, the days went on as before. New prisoners were taken elsewhere. Those who had dug the trench were reassigned. The land was leveled by a machine. The dust still flew with the wind. No one ever mentioned what had happened there again. Mountains of settling scores. On the roads crossing through Tyrol, the remnants of the German army wandered aimlessly. Some travelled alone, others in small groups with their hands raised, carrying the little they had left. They had left their weapons in ditches, barns, even hanging from trees, knowing that surrender was the only option. But in those mountains, those waiting weren't counting prisoners. Many had come down from the slopes with rifles slung over their shoulders and their faces covered. On the edges of the villages, Austrian partisans watched every curve. When they saw the Germans approach, they would come out onto the road. Some yelled for them to stop, others simply shot. Some knelt with their arms outstretched, but still received a shot to the head or chest. Several were made to sit in a row in front of a stone wall, and one by one they were taken out. The bodies rolled into the ditch they had already dug with the shovels they were forced to use earlier. In the higher valleys, some civilians blocked their path and ordered them to head toward a forest. Inside, they were made to dig holes with sticks, with their hands, with whatever they could find. Once ready, they were told to stand at the edge. They were silently aimed at and shot instantly. The earth didn't always cover them completely. Travelers passing through the area spoke of boots sticking out from the bushes or caps thrown over damp mounds. In one village at the foot of a slope, a group coming down the path was gathered. Their uniforms were stained, some with makeshift bandages. They were made to sit in the square while the people surrounded them. One of the elders of the village gave the signal, and 5 young men approached with shotguns. Each soldier was executed standing in front of the others. The blood ran between the stones while the others watched, motionless. Those who tried to hide in barns or houses were dragged out into the open field. In some cases, they were tied to trees with barbed wire. Right there, they were shot without a word. A young man who tried to flee down a ravine was shot in the back. Another was forced to carry his dead comrade's body before it was his turn. In the tunnels of the mountainous area, several trains were stranded with wounded soldiers or with no direction. The partisans climbed into the carriages, pushed them out and placed them against the rocks. Some shouted their names or showed papers. It was useless. In one of those lines they found a dozen bodies by the side of the tracks, hands tied, eyes open, staring at the sky. In other places the execution was quicker. They were intercepted while walking along dirt roads, ordered to leave their backpacks and shot in the face. A group was found at the edge of a lake, stacked between branches like firewood. A sergeant was pushed into the water with a stone tied around his neck. He floated for 2 days before anyone pulled him out. Those crossing the Alpine passes from Italy were also trapped. They had walked for days, exhausted, barefoot, many with fever or blindness. They were stopped on a bend in the road next to a cliff. They were made to form a line facing the abyss. One by one they fell after the shot. Some didn't even get to scream. Below, the bodies hit the rocks and lay still in the underbrush. In several mountain farms, the farmers took revenge for their dead children. They opened the doors for the soldiers, and when they entered looking for water, they beat them with axes, stabbed them with iron forks, or strangled them with work ropes. Then they buried the bodies among the animals or left them inside the barns and set them on fire. When the smoke reached, others came and found the remains. On the border with Bavaria, some tried to escape on bicycles or horseback. They were intercepted on the trails. In one case, they were made to run uphill, given a head start, and then shot in the back. They were scattered on the slope. One was found with a letter in his pocket, written in blood. No one read it. They just took the medal from around his neck and covered him with stones. The few who managed to hide among the rocks were betrayed by the smoke from their campfires. Once they were discovered, they were surrounded in silence and waited for them to lower their guard. One was caught while sleeping. They dragged him through the branches and hung him from a branch with his belt. Another was taken out of a cave where he was with a group of the wounded. Only one of them could stand up. He was forced to watch as the others were executed. The snow that fell in late May covered many of those remains. Visitors who came weeks later found frozen helmets, dry stains, rusted weapons, and boots half buried. In some areas, animals dragged bones onto the roads, but no one investigated. No one wrote down names. Only makeshift crosses and piles of stones covered them. The legal cleansing, how they justified it later. When the massacres had already passed, when the villages were filled with orphans, half-buried bodies and empty stations, the governments of Eastern Europe began preparing the official explanation. They didn't say there were executions, violent expulsions or mass abuses. They called it planned population relocation, administrative movement, or necessary relocation for security. At the central offices, documents were printed with official state letterheads, referring to demographic restructuring, as if it were an infrastructure project. The papers didn't mention the caravans of displaced people, the makeshift camps or the rapes. They only listed numbers: how many people were moved, how many houses were reassigned, how many kilometers were traveled. The officials who wrote those reports already knew what had happened. Some had even participated. But they adjusted the phrases, erased names, and swapped dates. If someone asked about the dead, they responded with evasions or blamed out-of-control elements. If a massacre was mentioned, it was presented as an isolated incident. Several countries organized commissions to document the events. In theory, they were for investigation. In practice, they served to cover up the truth. They went to the sites with cameras, took photos of empty houses, and smiled alongside new inhabitants. They avoided any mention of the past. When a reporter wanted to interview survivors, they were told it wasn't convenient and were expelled from the area. In government archives, entire files were destroyed. What remained was rewritten. In some cases, they changed the names of the villages. In others, they completely demolished German cemeteries and leveled the land to build public structures on top. Thus, both on paper and on the land, all traces disappeared. The new maps omitted entire villages. They invented new names for the same places. The schools taught another version of history. Children were told that those territories had always been part of the country. No mention was made of those who lived there before, not a word about what was done to them. In some local trials, attempts were made to prosecute soldiers or militia members who had participated in abuses, but these cases were quickly closed. The witnesses were ignored, the evidence disappeared, and the judges ruled that there was not enough evidence. Instead, those who helped in the reorganization were rewarded. They were given medals, promotions, and new homes. International organizations also knew what had occurred. They received reports, testimonies, even photographs. But they chose to focus on reconstruction, not on punishment. They said Europe needed to look forward. It wasn't the time to settle scores. Meanwhile, the victims remained buried without names, and the perpetrators walked free. The history books written afterward referred to a necessary process. They labeled the victims as potential collaborators of Nazism. It didn't matter if they were children, elderly people, or women who had never touched a weapon. They were all given the same label. In the official narratives, there were no abuses, only reactions justified by the context. Over time, the few who dared to tell what they saw were ignored. Some were labeled as traitors, others lost their jobs. In some cases, they were expelled from their own countries. They were accused of making things up, of wanting to clean the image of the Germans. No one took the time to listen to what they truly had to say. Decades later, when certain files began to be opened, historians found gaps, redactions, and unsigned documents. They discovered that many testimonies had been deliberately removed, that several files had been sent to be destroyed in state furnaces. Other documents simply disappeared, as if they had never existed. There were attempts at recognition. Some governments admitted that there had been excesses, but they always used vague words. They never spoke of crimes. They said they were unfortunate actions or mistakes of the moment. They never named the perpetrators, nor did they compensate the victims. Everything remained in speeches. On television, the documentaries avoided the topic. When talking about the end of the war, only celebrations, parades, and rebuilt cities were shown. The looted villages, the raped mothers, and the lines of Germans dragging suitcases in the rain were not shown. It was a partial story, told from only one side. There were camps where rations stopped arriving, and the ground was filled with bodies before names. Empty barns became transit sites, though almost no one ever left them. In small villages, churches began to serve as storage, and the bells ceased to ring. Some were taken to closed tunnels. Others ended up crammed into basements with mud up to their waists. The streets changed language without moving a stone. Surnames were crossed out with thick ink, and the children were left without fathers or any record of them. No monuments or plaques were built, but traces still remain, underground in hidden archives or in unidentifiable photos. Each story had its ending ripped away, leaving no space to tell it. Today, there are still families who don't know where their grandparents' bodies are. Others continue searching for their mother's name in lists that were never published, and although some voices have tried to change the official version, silence remains louder. Because that's how it was built, with manipulated papers, graves without headstones, and empty phrases that explained everything without saying anything.